Good afternoon. Dear colleagues, we're happy to welcome all of you today at the joint online seminar of the Institution of Social Policies of High School Economies at the World Bank. And the conference today is dedicated to income, poverty, and employment during COVID-19, anti- and post-crisis social protection policies. Before we begin today's conference, I would like to actually give you a small technical heads up. So please, to provide the highest quality of connection, please turn your mic off if you're not speaking, and if you need to say something, please push the button raise hand. It is below in the list of participants, or you can write your questions into the chat, and that's another way to express your opinion. We have simultaneous interpretation, so if you want to listen to Russian or English language, you need to click the button that looks like planet Earth, like a globe. You should click that button and choose either of the languages, English or Russian. If you're speaking Russian and listening to the Russian language translation, you should select Russian. If you're listening to the English language and speaking English, you should select English. I truly hope that things worked out for you well. Well, now I would like to hand the floor to the moderator of today's seminar, Mr. Vladimir Nazarov, the director of the Research Financial Institute. Please.
Спасибо большое, Ольга.
Yes, thank you very
Коллеги,
much,
очень
Olga.
рад вас всех
Dear
видеть.
colleagues,
Даже вот в
I'm
связи
very
с
happy
вирусом
to see
возникло
all of
новое
you.
слово в
We
английском
have
пока
this new
языке, в
word in
русском,
English
наверное, тоже
concerning the
возникнет.
virus. Probably we will have the
Emit.
similar word in Russian. It's
I'm
called
glad to emit you.
I'm
То
glad
есть
to
я рад вас
meet
всех
you,
видеть вот в таком
meaning meet you in the
формате.
electronic or digital form.
Тема, которую мы обсуждаем, она на
So,
самом деле
the
действительно
subject that we're going to
животрепещущая,
discuss
потому
is
что
as
именно
urgent as it
система
can be,
соцзащиты,
because
она
the welfare
оказалась в
system
таком центре
turned out to
общественного
be the
внимания
central
текущего
point of
кризиса.
social
Ну, во всяком
attention
случае,
during the crisis.
пока это действительно так, пока кризис еще,
That's the way it is. So
будем
far, the
надеяться, что не
crisis
сильно
is
затронет, но
still
пока и не затронул
in its
финансово-банковскую систему, поэтому
in its
сейчас все
hard condition, in
сосредоточились,
its hard
все глаза на рынке
situation,
труда,
and
соответственно, на
hopefully the
системе
crisis will
социальной
not affect
защиты, на
much the banking
поддержке
system.
доходов
Now we're
населения, на
mostly talking
системе
about the labor market,
здравоохранения,
about the
то есть все,
healthcare
что,
system,
в
about the
общем-то,
support
мы
of the
все, коллеги, с
population,
вами
about the welfare
занимаемся.
system and social
Поэтому я
support
очень
system.
благодарен
This is
Всемирному
something that we're
банку,
dealing
очень
with very
благодарен
closely.
Высшей
That's why
школе
I'm
экономики,
very
что
grateful
нам
to
удалось
Higher School of Economics and
собрать
the World Bank
столько
Group that we have been
хороших,
able to put
интересных
together so many
спикеров, с
amazing
которыми
people and
мы уже
speakers
давно-давно
whom we
работаем.
shall be able
Поэтому я,
to
наверное,
talk today, and we've been
свое
working for them for quite a
слово
while already.
сделаю,
That's
более
why I shall
содержательное выступление
probably
сделаю в конце,
present in
а
more
для
detail
приветствия
later
хотел бы,
today, but for the
чтобы присоединилась
intro,
Лилия
I would like to
Николаевна и
invite Irina Nikolaevna,
Рено Селигман.
please,
Лилия
and
Николаевна,
Renaud, please.
скажи.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. Good day, dear participants. I'm very happy to see your faces. Any event has kind of advantages and disadvantages. I would like to highlight the advantages. I'd probably not see any one of you, many of you personally, if not for Zoom and if not for the opportunity to talk remotely. I have not seen Yerzy for quite a while. Natalia Tikhonova is another person whom I have not seen for quite a long time. It's a great joy to see all of you. Welcome. And I would like to express my special gratitude to the partners of today's seminar, primarily to the World Bank Group. Renaud Seligman, I would like to express my special gratitude for your ongoing support and for contacting with the Russian community. You always excite us with the new initiatives of World Bank Group. They're very urgent, they're very timely, and we appreciate our friendship with the World Bank. Vladimir, another greeting to you. Today, Higher School of Economics is hosting the meeting. So you're all our hosts, you're all our guests. We have been friends and partners with Vladimir for quite a long time. And I believe that our friendship helps us to work together in this field and achieve new results. We invest more into partnership than into competition, and I think this is the right way to go. Today's seminar is quite special. We've been able to put together people from different countries. Today, we will be talking about international experience. Today, we shall listen to the experts from Great Britain, Germany, China, South Africa, Belarus, Bulgaria, Moldavia. Of course, we highly appreciate experience from Belarus, Moldavia, and Bulgaria and South Africa. As far as Great Britain and Germany are concerned, and even China, we see lots of information pouring in from those countries online. But if we speak about lesser known countries such as Bulgaria or Romania or Belarus, that's of course the situation when we don't have that much available information. That's why I appreciate our colleagues and partners who can share their opinions on the situation today. I would like to thank our speakers in advance. Thank you for being with us here today, sorry. And thank you for your participation. I would like to begin with Ruslan Yemtsov. Ruslan, hi there. As usually, we are very happy to see you. And thank you very much for agreeing to speak for us today. Ruslan Yemtsov is very well known, but I would like to introduce him once more. He is the head of the program on human capital programs development in China, South Korea, and Mongolia. He will share Chinese experience, which again is extremely interesting today for all of the experts because online, most of the people believe that China has been able to handle the pandemic better than anyone else. Therefore, Chinese experience is invaluable. I would like to give special thanks to Natin Umapati and Raman Zhukovsky. They will be speaking today about more global trends on how countries react to pandemic in their social welfare systems. They've done their analysis based on the constantly updated data from World Bank covering 180 countries. They're working on a daily basis with Belarus, Bulgaria, and Moldova, and I believe that that facet of experience is also precious. I would like to thank Robert Joyce for joining us. Robert, thank you so much, Deputy Director of the Institute of Fiscal Research in Great Britain. He will be talking about British experience of handling the social consequences of pandemic. Specifically, I would like to listen to the latest program about how the income compensation is happening in the UK. Countries are losing income, tax income primarily. Population is losing income. We have just been doing some calculations in our institute, mostly hypothetic, but we've been talking yesterday that according to our estimates, pandemic increased the poverty by the factor of 2. So, for example, if we had 12% in Russia, now we would have it 20 as at the benchmark of 24%. The measures that have been undertaken primarily, of course, we shall release the final results of the research later, but the measures that have been introduced allow to again reduce the poverty to the indicator of 16%, but still it is not enough to go to the figures that we have before the pandemic. So again, we would like to hear your measuring experience too. Yeji, thanks again. We miss you a lot in Russia. We miss you a lot, but yet again, I truly hope that we have new opportunities for interaction and we still can keep in touch. Jerzy is the head of the interministry project in Germany to integrate immigrants into the labor market. He's also working with the labor unions in Germany. Jerzy, your subject is extremely urgent and timely. I would like to talk more about this with you personally, because in Russia, we understand clearly that the situation with the labor market is something that is particularly important. We should pay lots of attention and invest lots of effort in this particular domain. That is why I truly hope that you will come back in Russia and help us to deal with the labor market. Mark Blatcher, thank you very much for being with us. This is the chief executive in charge of social development of the Treasury. He's working in the Treasury of the South Africa. And together with my friend Alexander Pasharats, Alexandra, if you're not here yet, I'm still greeting you. Hope to see you later. She is the head of the program of development of the human capital for a World Bank. She's working in 7 African countries. And Alexandra and Mark, they will represent the South Africa experience today. So the seminar is going to be exciting, very fruitful. I hope that we shall not have any technical failures. So for now, everything goes smoothly. Dear colleagues from the Research Institute, um, I hope we can begin. Vladimir, I'm handing you back the floor. Great. You have actually done most of my job being a partner. You have introduced everyone. Thank you. That's why I would like to hand the floor to our partner from the World Bank, Renaud Seligman. Renaud, the representative of the World Bank in Russia. A few words of greeting, please, to all of the colleagues. Thank you so much, Vladimir and Lilia. Thank you. I'm very happy to see all of you and greet all of you. I'm very happy because it's always a joy to work with the High School of Economics and with NIFI and the Ministry of Finance of Russia. They are great partners for us. And we always get to know new things when we are meeting and working with you, when working with the Financial Research Institute. We are experiencing a crisis that has never been before. This is a tremendous shock. As you have said, it is evident that the poverty levels will only increase, probably. Tomorrow will probably be worse than today.
I don't want to give too much of a preview of our upcoming Russian economic report. You're all familiar with that publication. And we will be in later June releasing the new version of the Russian economic report. You will see in there that we come up with an estimate of how much poverty will increase. And that's the first variable that we need to look at very carefully. But the second one that we need to look at also, and you will discuss this afternoon, is the extent to which the measures that have been taken by the government so far have been sufficient to compensate the massive loss of income that we've seen across the population, related to loss of jobs, but also related to other second round effects. And, you know, without disclosing too much, I could say that, you know, we were surprised at how effective the measures that have been taken seem like they will be, provided they are fully implemented. And that's where the rubber hits the road. It's about the actual execution and the ability to actually target the support to those that need it the most. And that takes me to my third and final point, which is that this crisis also underscores the importance of having a more targeted social assistance system, one that increases resilience because it is able to focus the resources that are available. And, you know, the fiscal space is going to narrow with this crisis. So it's becoming even more important to ensure that those resources that go to social assistance really go to those that need it the most. And that is the bottom of the pyramid. And now there is certainly a lot that can be done to improve the targeting of the social assistance programs, to reduce their fragmentation, and to better utilize technology in order to get that help where it needs to go. Ну, вообще, коллеги,
Overall, dear colleagues, I believe that Sergei Yesenin wrote once that, as you remember, you cannot see the face when you're too close to one. You should make a step back to see the face of the person. That's the word. These are the words of the great Russian poet Sergei Yesenin. We have experience of South Africa, China, Germany, Belarus, Bulgaria, Moldova. And on behalf of the World Bank, I'd like to say that we are very happy to be able to find the speakers to talk to you today. And I am I'm done with my intro, and I'm hoping that we'll have a very fruitful discussion. Thank you for your attention. Renaud, thank you so much. As a matter of fact, I think we are in the same boat here. I would like to actually hear the estimates from Lilia Nikolaevna, your estimates highlighting the results of the crisis in terms of poverty and loss of income. But the estimates will be changing over time because the months when we had the lockdown in Russia, the quarantine, those months kind of were the peak resilience test for the system. People were literally deprived of the opportunity to work and earn their living and get any sort of income. And it is obvious that the level of poverty really spiked within those months, and the income has dropped again drastically. But it would be more important to see how things will be changing from now on. Because if we actually be able to overcome the peak of the crisis and we would return to the sustainable growth of the income of the population, I believe that the level of poverty will also go down. That is why I believe that we should observe the situation and see whether we shall have the second and the third wave of crisis, and how would economy react to the first wave of crisis, because so far it is not clear how low we shall stoop, how low we should fall. We're still, kind of too much within the situation. We cannot have a bird's eye view on the changing situation, and I would even say the disaster that has happened. That's why any kind of social security system, any kind of welfare system, again, I would like to share my ideas, and I believe that some colleagues might confirm or reject my ideas. But it's just something that I see happening in Russia, in the US, in Germany, and what other countries of CIS are doing. And I believe that all of the social security systems were not flexible enough everywhere. They were not ready to react to the crisis. One of the things that we did well, I mean, we did well the things we were doing well before the crisis. We knew how to do some things well before the crisis. Turned out that we could do the same things well during the crisis. If we talk about Russian tax agency, they did a very well app, very good app for entrepreneurs, for self-employed people who could pay taxes very quickly via the app without handing in any other taxation documentation. And we also did the tax return to self-employed to support them, because most of them really lost the income. Since the app was well developed and well designed, it was very easy actually to do the tax return. All of the taxes that the self-employed paid over a certain period of time were quickly returned, and people appreciate that. And that was a sign that the things that the government is saying, those are the things that the government is doing. We also allowed businesses to postpone mandatory social payments and taxes. Another thing that we did is that the citizens of Russia don't have to pay special taxes to pay the buildings, to pay for the repair works of the buildings that they're living in. And that tax has also been canceled for a while. So that reduced the rent for almost every single person. Another measure, the things that we were not good at before the crisis remained slow and inefficient during the crisis. For example, in Russia, we don't have the efficient employment system in Russia. And during the crisis, that system did not work well. And any kind of welfare payments and unemployment payments, again, were not distributed very efficiently. So there's a total range, the entire range of problems there. So like many other countries in the world, for example, the Germans in the last crisis, they did special payments for people who are self-employed. And maybe Jerzy will have a different point of view here, but I believe that, again, in Germany, this kind of payment worked very well and helped to really handle the unemployment and transfer money through the employers to the employees without breaking the links between employer and employee when the crisis was actually breaking those links. So it's not a structural crisis now that we have been doing something wrong in the world. We have over-investing, the markets got overheated. No, things in the world were happening pretty fine. It's just that we have faced this sudden virus and we had to shut down half of global economy. And this kind of crisis obviously does not require kind of the mass bankruptcies or bailouts or mass unemployment to restructure the economy. This kind of crisis, on the contrary, calls us to support the existing structure of economy and employment. And the solutions that we apply will be efficient. And this kind of German payment that they've been doing, social payment for, maybe would stand in the way of economy changing in a different kind of crisis. But within this crisis, that kind of payment was, again, very, very fitting. The system responded to the crisis very well, and yet it's very hard for a system to change quickly. When we talk about social security and social support system, we should should use different kind of counter-cyclic policy tools. Again, I would like to say once more that we have not it is impossible to invent something super cool and super new during the crisis. The things that were bad will remain bad during the crisis. For example, the US don't have a good system to inform the population and help the unemployed. So people were actually manually standing in line and getting their checks. If there is a system where things work fine and systems are digitalized, they were just getting everything digitally on their credit card accounts. Vladimir, may I just interrupt you? We have the technical notion. Not everybody is able to listen to the translation. I would like to say a few words on behalf of the host that we have this button translation. It is next to the button screen share, and you have to select their language, either English if you're speaking and listening in English, or Russian if you're speaking and listening Russian. Then you will hear the translation. У нас if you're working in a full screen mode, the buttons might be up there. Yes, I know it's important. I know it is important. I would like to continue. This crisis actually has shown that the classic system of social security, when we have some very tight connection, certain payments to certain welfare. So the income is connected to the spending. And there is link at the level of a human being. So you've been working, you've been paying taxes, and during the crisis, you're getting welfare payments. If you have not been paying taxes, you will not get any help. So you were not doing any payments, you were not. So this kind of approach turned out to be totally non-viable, and during the crisis, the payroll funds turned out to be one of the most vulnerable tax bases. So all of the measures targeted at the employment support, poverty prevention could not be paid for with a payroll fund. Of course, these kind of measures will be financed from the global income that the budget has, and the national budget doesn't have enough money, so the government then has to borrow some money, and we see large-scale borrowing campaigns. So this link about the income, the spending, and the payments did not work in the crisis. So a number of demands that were inherent to the social security systems, those characteristics turned out to be totally inhumane during the crisis. They needed to be reconsidered radically. For example, if before the crisis it was pretty obvious that you have to work 26 weeks last year to get unemployment payments this year, but when you go to the employment center, again, the employment center has to be looking for a job for you for 10 days. Some kind of unemployment benefit office or labor registry should be looking technically a job for you for 10 days before giving you the payment. Of course, where would they be looking for a job if there are no jobs at all during the crisis? So those kind of technical filters needed to be reconsidered, and they have been reconsidered in a number of countries. Some other social security measures, they covered people who are working part-time and all of kind of the informal economy. So it turned out that certain countries had to somehow deal with the informal part of the economy. How how the governments have been able to handle the situation. First of all, they paid special attention to pay people with lower income. We had two kind of special payments for families with children without means testing. There was a special attention to those people who lost their job without any means testing, without any connection to your prior income. In the US, they added another $600 per person in addition to the number of payments that the system would have to pay according to the previous income that the people were getting. So the traditional principles were widely reconsidered. In the US, in 38 states, the welfare payment, the unemployment payment, was actually higher than the average salary. That is, of course, something completely outlandish. And some people believe that as long as this money is being paid in states, it will actually make a negative effect on employment. What does it lead us to? That leads us to the idea that we need some kind of different system of social help, the system that will be more flexible, the system that could be quickly readjusted for the changing economic condition. Obviously, it is not efficient to help everybody. We actually had a grand discussion talking about whether we should just give everybody a pile of money, every single citizen of Russia, no matter what's the income and employment situation. I believe that this kind of measure is not efficient because we can spend a huge amount of money. And by the way, as Margaret Thatcher has said, there's no public money. There's only money of taxpayers. There's no public money. There's tax money. And some countries are very proud for spending a lot of money. And I don't think that's the reason to be proud. Because if that money was not spent to help the lowest income groups of the population, there's no reason to be proud, because this will be future debt, and the rest of the country will have to pay that debt. That will be an extra tax burden, including poor people. So the help should be targeted. The help should be efficient. It should be targeted at those who are in the most need. And again, let's take a look at the US. We now see a V-shaped growth of the car sales, and people are buying more houses. People are actually getting into mortgage. What does that mean? It means that the crisis influenced people differently. Some people didn't lose any income. Some people were working remotely perfectly well. They were getting their salary. Why these people would need to get any additional payment? This will be just an extra tax burden for low-income groups of the population, their children in the future. Again, the system should know somehow about the level of income and spending of the citizens to readjust quickly based on this information and define who needs to get the aid, the payments, the welfare, etc., the relief, the benefits. Now even people in Russia don't know where to address, which ministry, which agency to address to get the benefits and the relief. We have all kinds of welfare payments, depending on the age of people, age of children, depending on the number of children in the family, many filters there, many types of welfare payments, and people are very much misled because there are tons of different welfare payments, different filters, different means testing approaches, because people are confused. It would be easier to have one single type of welfare payment that sustains the level of income of the population, but filters, again, may vary depending on the situation. When things are business as usual, the economy is fine, the filters can be more rigid. So people who are employed would rather go to some employment center to get the job instead of getting a paycheck or getting a welfare check. Or, for example, people might be getting welfare not right away, but a bit later after their income has actually fallen. If the crisis is harsh, for example, sometimes we need to uh, react to the drop of the income in the population right away without waiting for the fall of the income. We should not make people go to some kind of employment center, because the employment center will not be able to find any job because there are no jobs whatsoever. And Lilia Nikolaevna is right saying that we should introduce more people to some kind of welfare programs now. So these are some of my theoretical ideas. And I would like to hand the floor to Ruslan Yemtsov. He will be speaking what's the idea? Because why am I handing the floor to him? Because the virus began in China, so let us see how China has been able to handle the situation.
Спасибо большое, Владимир. Приветствую вас. Очень приятно выступать, очень приятно видеть лица.
Thank you, Ruslan. It is very good to, of course,
it's a pleasure to see you.
To be here, and I would like to, of course, say about the situation, what was happening in China within the context when, of course, with comparison with the global picture, the situation. And of course, I will base all of my assumptions, all the materials of World Bank that were prepared by an entire team under the aegis of Ugo Gentilini. They are posted on a weekly basis on the World Bank website. I will send you the note with all of the links included, and you will be able to take a look in actually real time how the balance of measures are changing, of how countries are reacting, and trying to fight the repercussions of this financial crisis. So it would be very interesting to listen to other countries' cases on this seminar as well. First of all, I would like to say that it is very important of course, to differentiate, and I think all of the moderators and speakers said that two stages need to be differentiated. First of all is the initial reaction, the quarantine effect, and the cessation of forced employment and the mobility of citizens, and measures that are present there, you know, they are not short-term. So then we have a task on our hands on how exactly should we react on economic, of course, results of the crisis. And they are quite dire, because at the first stage, nobody actually could have imagined what sort of course, repercussions we could have. And on the second stage, these repercussions are seen much more clearly. And all of the forecasts of Monetary Fund and World Bank are becoming more and more pessimistic. So we had the initial assessment throughout the year of the changing of employment rate. All over the world, we were talking about a figure of 40 million people that would end up beyond the poverty line. Now, this number, I think, grew up to 150 million people, and it still continues to grow. So in China, there was the same situation. When we first started and to make some forecasts, at the start we said that the economic growth that is expected in 2020 will be, of course, decreasing from 6% that were initially expected to 5.5%. Then we had the further change to 4.5%, and now we can, I think, safely assume that we can expect a growth of 0.5% in 2020. And of course, it is related to the fact of not only, and I will digress and I will go on a different tangent, I think is related to what this crisis has touched upon. This crisis touched upon serious geopolitical changes, and also on the attempts of different countries to stop the globalization factor. And of course, if necessary, they will restructure their own production chains. It also affected a highly increased level of debts, both of governments and private sector, companies and small enterprises all over the world. And China is no exception to this rule. I think it believes it's one of the most painful points of this crisis. So all of these factors bring us to the point where this crisis is becoming very unnatural, and it is becoming into global recession and the global economic crisis, which of course will lead to the necessity of quick reactions and effective ones to that. So how exactly was the economic politics in China was changing throughout the pandemic? I will show you on this presentation, on this picture, that reflects the changes in social policies and major decisions that were undertaken in China. So the decisions of, for example, the cessation of employment and closing down, shutting down, I think, a big part of country that was undertaken on the 23rd of January. So the initial change and the initial decision on all of the financial aid and benefits and the changes of conditions of their acceptance, and then the changes of the amount of financial aid happened again at the end of January. So it was quite quick. The unemployment welfare benefits, so basically what Vladimir was telling us about, and the cancellation of the conditions of employer to work for a number of weeks in order to become the subject of this welfare benefits happened at the very start of January. Then they had the further changes of all of the payments on temporary unemployment. And by the end of February, we have seen quite an interesting changes on the employment market policies, which first of all was spurred by the necessity to retrain people and the necessity of them gaining new qualifications. This was happening because of the local authorities that didn't have enough resources to bring everybody back and making them actively employed after overcoming the repercussions of crisis. I'm sorry, we cannot see the image that you're trying to share with us. Oh, wait, one sec. Yeah, just click the share screen button. Okay, share, one sec. Right, for some reason this button doesn't work, as it seems. Let me try it again. Well, okay, then I will try to share the materials. Then I will share the materials. Yeah, maybe you can send these materials to Olga or other organizer and they will share their screen, because we have to check whether the organizers have given you an opportunity and the option to share screen. No, we've seen that, but Ruslan was the last change to the agenda, so if I may share, then I will do it. Okay, so the material that I'm sending to you right now, please open the picture that I'm sending to you. Very well. Right, next. So how did the configuration of all the measures look like? So if we take a look at the global monitoring sector, then countries pretty much reacted to, and China again is not exclusion to the factor. They went in three different ways in changes their social benefits and the social welfare. So the first way was to just increase the amount of money. In China, it happened quite fast. I think after a week of the start of the crisis, and it was, of course, justified not by the fact that citizens are in need, but because of the growth of inflation in China. So there were, of course, some information that local retailers are spiking up the prices, especially on the groceries. There were some complications in delivery services. And I think they increased these benefits because of that, and quite quickly. But total expenditures were not that high because, again, this was a temporary stopgap solution. I think throughout the period of those changes, I believe they've spent 0.01% of GDP, so that's not a lot. Then 0.6% of their GDP went for the cancellations of all of the payments for social insurance measures. So a medical insurance, pension fund, and unemployment welfare fund. So again, this measure was a temporary, and it was of course related to the fact that they had to ease the load on the budget, on the finances of, first of all, private sector, and give them opportunity to basically, well, try to hunker down during the cessation of their financial activity. But what's more interesting is that just now, I think at the end of April, just a month ago, they made another decision on permanent changes in the social insurance system. They're expanding it. So the Chinese small enterprises welfare DBAO fund encompasses many dozens of millions of people, but that's less than 4% of total population of China. So it became clear that among the vulnerable people who suffered the most as a result of these economic turbulences, of course, there are much more than just 4%. So the second phase of crisis is transferring from crisis to structural changes, of course, called for the changes in social policies. And this is what is happening right now. And it's quite interesting to monitor all that. What else can I tell you about the peculiarities and specifications of these measures and these activities and what we can draw from that, especially for Russia? Well, basically, I think you can draw a rule of a thumb. So Martin Navalny, an expert, I think a person who we know a lot, he dedicated his lifetime work to the study of poverty. factor, he stated the following, that during the last economic forecast that we have, is that the smallest amount of expenditures when having, this targeted approach that we have right now, these exclusions that we have. So the smallest expenditures that would allow us to, prevent poverty growth calls for about the investments of 2% of GDP. Of course, this varies based on the countries and based on how many people were initially beyond the poverty line. This, of course, will change this percentage, but at the very least, we can say that this rule of the thumb, the Chinese scenario, shows us that this system of social policies were inexperienced and underdeveloped. So they spend about 0.4% on just one-off cash transfers, not because they didn't want to support more people, but because the system could not handle the influx of new receivers of this payments, and it is quite asynchronized. It's not centralized. It is very difficult to manage it because it is regional based, and so the amount of welfare benefits also are based on the local authorities level and how they set the poverty line factor and how they estimate how much we should actually help people. And because of this decentralization, it was impossible to manage the crisis. It was impossible to expand their social policies framework. And so the system was, discovered to have lots of inequalities. And there were a lot of arguments about the reforms in China. There were a lot of heated arguments focused especially on the volition to, first of all, retain this social insurance resemblance to local level, but with that in mind also provide some national level standards in terms of providing help, financial benefits, and welfare help, and the level of their involvement. Another interesting aspect, which of course Vladimir touched upon, is related to the arguments whether we should implement universal basic income or not. In China and Hong Kong, so the Hong Kong and this part of China, they decided to actually implement the universal basic income as one of payment just to maintain the demand as a measure of stimulating of economic activity. In China, it provides to be quite a problem. For example, first quarter of 2020, where we had this basically the most painful situation, all of these capacities were brought down by 3 or 4%, and total consumption was brought down by 12%. So this illustrates these numbers. I think they're quite interesting, and I do hope that in Russia we also have these studies and forecasts. So these numbers show us that usually in terms and in time of ambiguity, people are spending less and saving more. And even though we are trying to stimulate people to actually do the opposite, this measure allowed the series of countries, of course, to bring down the consequences of ending up beyond the poverty line. And these reactions, of course, lead to the reversal multiplicator factor. So Hong Kong has chosen this universal basic income as the one-off payment. China is doing the opposite because they don't have the opportunity to do so considering their economic state. But other countries and other municipalities maybe have taken different approach. They started to use this digital vouchers. I think, it's an ordinary thing when you try to stimulate the sales, and big retailers, they are doing a lot of these loyalty benefits and hot sales. In China, they were administrating all that, and these retailers were receiving 50% or more subsidies to do so. So these vouchers were time limited, and everybody was hoping that people would get some money and they would spend it rather than save it and spend it now when we most need it. And it actually worked. according to the preliminary studies, it showed that it was quite successful, and it actually increased the disparity between the society, because the people who had enough money, they participated in this program. So all in all, this measure shows how important it is to have an adequate and robust insurance and social insurance policies that helps all layers and all levels of income of population and how quickly it can react. So I think this is it. This is everything that I wanted to share with you. I will not take more time from different speakers, so thank you so much. And as I said, I will share the materials that I do hope our organizers will make available for everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Ruslan. It was quite an interesting presentation. I think some colleagues are raising hands. If you have any questions, please write them into the chat box. Then we'll give the floor to our speakers. And now I would like to give the floor to Nitin Umampati. I think he will follow up and tell us about the global trend and explain the situation about the countries that are closest to us, Moldova, Bulgaria, Belarus.
Спасибо. Добрый день, коллеги.
Good afternoon, colleagues.
Тема нашей презентации — это ковид и социальная помощь, но я хочу начать свою презентацию с выдержки из постоянного мониторинга Всемирного банка по ссылке, о которой говорил Руслан. Вы сможете ознакомиться с более детальным описанием. На этой карте вот вы видите отмечены страны синим цветом, объявивших о мерах по социальной защите для борьбы с последствиями эпидемии. Синий цвет успокаивает. Вы можете видеть, что практически все страны в мире запустили новые или адаптировали существующие программы.
Has launched their own programs.
На следующем графике вот вы видите тренд количества стран, которые реализовали меры для борьбы с экономическими последствиями пандемии, также тренд количества программ. И также видим, что есть стремительное увеличение количества программ социальной защиты с 20 марта, когда начинался этот тренд, это примерно 45 стран объявили в общей сложности программ, то по состоянию на 22 мая уже было примерно 190 стран, работает почти 1000 таких программ. Вот в этой таблице вы видите распределение категорий клиентов программ. Программы социальной защиты включали в себя денежные выплаты, предоставление различных ваучеров, поддержки занятости, либо уязвимых категорий, таких как семьи с детьми, а также смягчение финансовых обязательств. Но явно прослеживается доминирующая роль денежных переводов как меры социальной защиты. Ну и еще один срез, анализ мер, принимаемых в мире, это средняя продолжительность программ помощи. И она равняется в среднем 3 месяцам. Но при этом размерный выплат может быть достаточно щедрым. В среднем это 25% месячного размера ВВП, месячного, поскольку эти программы носят кратковременный характер, и при этом рост выплат по сравнению с периодом до пандемии в глобальном масштабе в среднем составил примерно 2,5%.
Nitin, I'm sorry. Could you please select the Russian language channel so that we can hear to you clearly for the interpretation and for the recording? Yeah, at the bottom of the task bar.
Я использую iPad, поэтому здесь.
No, I use an iPad, so that's why it's quite.
Мне нужно выбрать русский, понятно.
So I need to select Russian channel. Yeah, you have. Okay, I'm almost done anyway. So I think the last thing I would like to add before I give the floor to Roman is that adaptation of existing programs of social assistance, they of course were vertically scaled. So towards more generous payments and the expenditures of classes and categories of people. So in several countries, we've seen the expenditures in both of those axes. And on this note, I think I will conclude with how we can actually see the repercussions of this. And these are the vectors of consequences of pandemic. And we will talk more about what sort of measures in, for example, Belarus and other countries were done. So I give the floor now to Roman Zhukovsky.
Спасибо, Никин. Я на секунду перестану делиться экраном, потому что иначе я не могу ни выбрать русский язык, ни включить свою камеру. Такой как-то у меня работает система.
Camera. 1 second, please. Roman, I can share your screen if you'd like to. No, I mean, when I'm sharing the screen, all of the buttons disappear. So if I want to change something, I have to, stop sharing the screen first. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you a lot for giving me an opportunity to provide this presentation, and I would like to show you several generalizations, if you will, about these measures and what sort of actions were undertaken. And I'm really happy to see that they are quite similar, and they correlate with those comments that Mr. Nazarov said and Mr. Yentsov also said. And before we can talk about graduality of measures that were enrolled and comparisons of countries, I would like to tell you how we perceive the vectors of economic consequences of pandemic. And of course, we can divide them into 3 groups. First of all is the growth of disparity. It's not only about poverty, but also my colleagues also mentioned about this non-homogeneous effects of the crisis for many classes of our population. So some people are losing, some are winning. But generally speaking, we are seeing the increase in this social gap, and we can see it in many countries that these disparities can lead to social tensions in those countries. And I personally believe that what we are witnessing right now, the things that we see in the United States of America, this is an actual repercussion of this disparity. So people are feel distanced much more than they've felt ever before because of the scenario that is unfolding in front of our eyes. And of course, it decreases the efficiency of measures that the government can undertake in its wake to stop the effect of pandemic on the economy. Second vector, of course, is the change of business models. A simple example is when many companies start to realize that when they try to restructure, they can make more money right now, so they have no need to rely on local employers, and you can effectively work after, again, downsizing in many industries, which of course will lead to the restructuring of the employment formats. So in some countries it will mean more employed people, in some less. One of the cases of such effect happens in many dimensions, not just in private sector. And as for the third vector of the consequences, they're all, of course, are interlinked, but we outlined the third one as a separate one because it is related to the fact that even when the economy is going to be restored, they will not find employment, because in the new reality after the pandemic, the employment will require new qualifications. For example, if you are not in IT sector, if you started working remotely, it will be very difficult for you because, again, you are not tech savvy, you don't have the necessary skills and talents, and that is why you will not be able to find a decent job. I've already mentioned briefly about why we were focusing on the disparity and social gaps. And it is not only just related to social tension that we are seeing being grown and the inactivity and inefficiency of government policies, but also because it can cause very long-standing effects caused by this short-term shock. So some people will try to handle the crisis because they will undertake measures to the loss of human capital. One of the examples may be small enterprise will sell all of its assets, let all of the people go, and for them to start anew with a clean slate will be difficult. And this happened after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. If you remember, there was a brain leak. So it leads to long-term effects, and of course, it will lead to the drop of the efficiency of the labor, and material resources are also dropping. So there will not be an optimal situation for you to use your old skills and old habits. I will not mention the restructuring of the employment format because I've already outlined how it can happen. But one of the effects that I've mentioned is related to the measure that the restructuring of employment system will lead, of course, to their consumption element, of course, which will affect the economy as a whole. Now, based on the framework I've just assumed, I want to make a generalization that the majority of measures of social assistance that were mentioned, that Mr. Yemtsov mentioned and Mr. Nazarov mentioned, they are long-term ones, and they are based on already existing social assistance programs. And of course, there's the rationale behind this, because of course you need to enroll a social assistance program on top of one that you have already now. And of course, the government is inclined to help the people who are the most vulnerable during times of crisis, and usually they're the ones that are already receiving their assistance. But at the same time, there are examples of creating absolutely brand new programs. For example, if some portion of people were not vulnerable before and were not covered by existing social assistance formats, within this context, I would like to give examples of solutions, because we've seen a lot of solutions being undertaken by many countries, not just Russia and China, but we'll stop only the key solutions and key measures. And these key measures, in our humble opinion, demonstrate sort of a variety of focuses and emphasis, whether expanding current social assistance programs or creating new measures. I wanted to take Moldova as the first example. So the initial reaction of Moldova to the crisis was to stimulate employment through recompensating of all the tax payments and fees. For instance, they were reimbursing them on the federal level, and the payments that were given to, again, national level and local level of tax services. I'm talking about the medical insurance and pension funds, and of course the income tax. So all of those payments, they were one way or another tied to unemployment welfare program, and so in this way they were subsidizing the employment factor, because if they weren't going to do anything about this, it would also lead to the further unemployment. In this way, they try to retain the employment rate of the country. And what's interesting is that this measure was done through the tax service, first and foremost, because it is related to all of the payments, and a portion of those payments, of course, are taxpayer money. But the major reason behind that was that the capacity of tax services to work with the private sector was much more effective than if they would resort to the help of employment agencies or other services or agencies and institutions as well, because they are already experienced in that. So they were selected to do the job. But if there were additional stimulus measures that were undertaken further, then I think the initial reaction again would be to enlist tax service, because again, the interaction and the relation between private sector and tax service is closer than ever. Second measure that Moldova has undertaken was to help poor families. There is a program in the country that is called social aid, and it is basically a welfare benefit program. It is calculated as the minimum wage. And in case if a family gets less money than minimum wage, then this program takes them as a subject and they subsidize all of the expenditures and they cover those. So the first measure that was undertaken this year is that a portion of the money that was calculated for one person, adult person, was increased, and it led to the doubling effect of all of the payments of this social aid program. Again, this program was an emergency measure, was implemented, I think, less than 45 days ago. But for families with children, the amount of money for adult person was also increased. So basically, the protection of families with children, it stayed at increased level, even in the wake of this emergency situation of pandemic. But what's more interesting was another measure, a measure related to helping unemployed people and those that are registered, officially registered as unemployed people. So for them, they settled for common universal bar, regardless of whether they pay some payments or fees or not. And in this way, Moldova tried to react to all of the challenges that were very specific for the country itself, because there was this unregistered employment people and a lot of immigrants that also are working in the country. So that is why the amount of money was set in a way that it is a little bit less their average income that they received pre-pandemic. And I believe that a series of people that were becoming a subject for this program. Oh, sorry. So this program is applied for everybody, even if a person and its income would be less than taxes, he would still receive the subsidies on top of that. And what's more interesting is the situation that is related to this universal program, that a person was receiving this financial aid if he would also become a subject of universal medical care. So on Moldova, it is also used as a mechanism to affect people, to make them as subjects and include them in the system of medical insurance. If there are no questions on this slide, because when I'm sharing screen, I can't see the chat window. So if there are any questions, please go, just tell me so that I could answer all of the questions. If there are no questions, then I will move on to the example of Bulgaria. So Bulgaria implemented a whole series of brand new programs that directly affect on retaining the employment rate. So 60% went to the employment fund and the payroll budget. In case of Belarus, it was a little bit less. This subsidy didn't have any correlations to the level of income. For example, everybody was working with the payroll budget system, so there was a mechanism in accordance to which enterprises, they declare about their volition in case that they are not assigned any subsidies, that they are going to fire a certain amount of people. Basically, when enterprise does make such declaration, then this payroll budget agency makes and gives them the payment. As for the details of this program, right now we're working in accordance to the clarification of this mechanism, because we're hearing lots of mixed opinions from participants that a lot is unclear because it's a brand new program and people are getting confused. But I wanted to give this as an example, as an indicator of exclusivity. There are another cases, for example, in South Korea, their payroll budget was covering for unemployed people as well. But this is an interesting situation that is unfolding in Bulgaria, which basically states that it is necessary to have significant subsidies to retain the employment rate in the country. And in several other countries, we are seeing similar stories, which of course is a challenge not just for payroll budget, but for the employment system as a whole, or other classes of people that are also beyond the poverty line or affected by the crisis the most. Another two measures were undertaken by Bulgaria. They are related to the fact that they provide additional payments for employees with children. Another separate payment is given to workers that are right now on unemployed leave or other welfare programs. So this payment, this is also tied with the payroll budget. They also provide another in-kind benefits. I forgot the term and definition in Russian, but basically yeah, in kind means other than money. Yeah, other than money. So the assistance given in format other than money is related, first of all, and focused on the most vulnerable classes of people. And another example that I would like to touch upon is the Belarus scenario. So Belarus, before pandemic, was relying more on basically guarantee is not the right word for this, but let's use it for guaranteeing the employment other than the protection and protecting unemployed people. So basically they were guaranteeing employment for all of the classes of people in public and private sector. And the ideology of country was based upon the idea that if a person who wants to find the job, he will find it. Right now, we are experiencing a situation where, of course, a lot of enterprises, even the public sector, they are on standing by, and it's not their fault. So that's why right now, all of these employees, which enterprises are in standing by, they are being recompensated 2/3 of their salary. So basically, they can enjoy a relatively same level of income than pre-crisis, and it of course has to be higher than the minimum wage. And if it's not, then the government will give additional payments to these employees with the size of minimum wage. So basically, the difference between their actual income and minimum wage will be recompensated if your enterprise is in standing by mode. So they implemented a special mechanism for this in Belarus. They calculate which industries are on standing by, and they are being inputted into registries, and they calculate their incomes and recompensate if necessary. Another measure is more interesting in Belarus. So all of the unemployment benefits checks, they were quite small in monetary amount before the crisis. And right now they are increasing the money they are paying for unemployed people. So basically they are increasing it basically 10 times than before. And another measure is again for destitute families and poor families. They calculate income on the basis of previous 3 months. So this way they are trying to ease the pressure of the crisis on them. But what's interesting about this is that traditionally speaking, they calculated the income of all previous year. So that is why right now we're seeing that only 3 months are being calculated. So they shortened this time duration from 12 to 3 months. So for example, in the last 3 months, family experienced a drop of their incomes. For example, somebody lost their jobs and so on. The government will take that into consideration and give them additional subsidies. And after these examples that I've provided you with, I also would like to give you a generalization, which I mentioned at the start. So, of course, these measures of quick reaction, they have two weak points. They are related to the factors that, of course, they have some sort of inheritance with the existing social assistance programs. For example, if you have a social assistance program before the crisis and it had certain errors in it, it still retains them during the crisis. And it also pertains to the fact of all of the errors of including the right people in the social assistance programs, because in most cases, these programs they require people to bring some necessary documents to offices and such. And of course, this, for example, in the US, where the amount of applications was just skyrocketing, and it can lead potentially to people who during the pandemic prefer not to seek further employment because they see that the government is bankrolling them, and it is actually higher than the income that they could have received. So there is absolutely no risk on staying unemployed. Second vulnerability that I also need to mention is that these programs usually are focused on the reinforcing of groups that were vulnerable before the crisis, and now they are gaining the traits and characteristics that again were natural for assistances and programs that existed before the crisis. So there was no universal measure of reaction, and again it caused the disparity of social nature. And it is basically the dark side of quick responses, because a quick response usually is not an accurate one. And as my colleague just said, the duration of such programs is 3 months, and it is not a capable instrument that could actually calculate efficiently the effect of economy that is caused by the pandemic. So basically, we should instead opt for long-term reactions than the short burst ones. So how we can see from the example of the financial crisis of 2008, there was a quantitative expansion of those programs. I believe that this similar expansion could also be enrolled in the social side of assistance to people. As mentioned, universal basic income can be considered, or for example, certain countries are right now trying to generalize this definition of new normality for employees, because right now the employment code is also being restructured, because before you had to find a job within a week. Now they're changing the definition from week to month. So they are easing the requirements for the unemployed people. Or for example, how we're going to consider the overtime work and so on. As for the community work, they are becoming much more important than before. So I think they will become a part of the service industries. For example, we see the spike of the delivery services and other transportation operators and so on. And as we've already mentioned about the restructuring that is related to the requirements, necessary skills that an employee should possess, we see in reality that if a person is not tech savvy or doesn't work in IT, it will be very difficult for him to survive in this new normality because, again, the person possesses outdated and obsolete skills that are no longer required by anyone. So this is a very pressing issue and very serious matter. And right now we are in talks with a series of countries that are trying to get out of this problem. Roman, I'm sorry, you are going beyond the time frame. Yes, I'm sorry. This was the last slide. Thank you.
Wanted to ask you a question. This subsidy, salary subsidy up to 60%, how typical is it amongst other countries? Because we have the subsidy of one minimum wage for those who suffered from the COVID, for the employees of those factories and enterprises that suffered in the COVID. So what is this share of the salary that has been subsidized? There's not a typical figure, and that's why I gave the example, because it's particularly interesting. There are examples of how the wage is being subsidized with certain limitations, and they're not universal. The most radical that I've seen, and probably you can read particular measures that every single country has introduced. Ruslan will share the link. It's all there described. But the most radical that I've seen is the 90% subsidy of the payroll budget. But that mostly covered the people that were supposed to be fired, not furloughed. I think the Germans introduced the standard starting with 60% up till 80%. That was a gap that kind of defined the crisis. This is something that the Germans had in the previous crisis, and they have reconsidered it partially. But this crisis, I think the Germans were the first to invent this thing, and the others are just copying this thing. When we were introducing a similar measure in Russia, we actually copied the Germans. Of course, our minimum wage is of course smaller than 60%. But if we look at the taxes, at the taxation data, we were taking them into account, this kind of data into account when we were making a decision. So according to our estimates, it's about 50% of the median wage for those industries that suffered the most. Turned out that the salary level there is relatively low, and the median is about 2 minimal wage there. I thought it's going to be higher, but it's not. So these are particularly the industries that suffered a lot, medium, small-sized enterprises. You're right, Vladimir. A median is 2 minimal wage, and not only in those industries that suffered the most, but that's just the general indicator for business. And don't forget about what we call individual entrepreneur in Russian legal system. This is a backbone of small and medium-sized business in Russia. And I believe that in those industries that suffered the most, we have a specifically dense concentration of small and medium-sized enterprises and this individual entrepreneurs. We have Jihangir Nigmatov joining in with us. We were talking about the experience of developing countries, and I believe that his comment will be specifically useful. He'll be talking about the country of Uzbekistan, about the measure of social support and what they're going to do after COVID. Jihangir, very happy to see you. Can you hear me though? Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you well. Yeah. Dear Mr. Moderator, Vladimir, dear colleagues, I will be brief, and I will briefly tell about what we have done. But before that, let me greet you from the sunny country of Uzbekistan. Some of my friends from the northern countries, including my friends from Russia, they're saying that Uzbekistan is a very sunny land. But they are as right as ever today. We have plenty of sun today. The temperature has actually went down, but we have plus 36 in Celsius. So our life is rescued by conditioning, air conditioning, and eventually our healthcare system. So thank you for the invitation. Before I describe the measures that we have introduced in Uzbekistan, I want and tell about how we're doing with COVID here. So for the moment, we have identified about 4,000 COVID cases. 80% of people have actually been discharged from the hospital. We have only 60 deaths. The situation is under control. The healthcare system has been able to sustain the situation. It goes without saying that introduction of some sort of mandatory limitation was a huge strike to our economy. Of course, that was reflected on the level of income and the employment level, and of course, the economy overall. According to the data of different financial institutions, the GDP growth is going to slow down, being about 1.5, 1.6%, as opposed to the forecast that we had before crisis, that was 5.7, 5.8% of GDP growth. And like in many other countries, there's a very strong uncertainty and ambiguity. Nobody knows how long the pandemic will last and how broad it will be. As far as the single households go, we had the research from the World Bank that covers the period in March, April, and May, the period of pandemic. So if we speak about the households with the breadwinner, so we had 85% of the households that had at least one breadwinner. Now we have only 43% of the households that have the breadwinner. So if we compare current time with March, on March 1st, we had the first case of COVID in Uzbekistan. So for those people who live before, the share of people who live beyond the poverty line is now 8.7%. It was supposed to be 7.4. That means that in our particular case, that's about 500,000 people beyond the poverty line. Of course, the group that was hit the worst is self-employed. The number of people who reported the income from self-employment dropped by 67%. So that's why the government made a decision to support the economy, business, and the population. The classification here is standard. We have business, we have population, we have financial markets, etc. So since the first COVID case on March 15th in Uzbekistan, we have introduced lots of executive orders to soften the blow of pandemic on national economy. As a result, over 500,000 businesses and entrepreneurs, that is about 8 million people, that's the quarter of our population, got the preferences and benefits amounting to $3 million US. We had certain measures. We of course introduced quarantine, supported strategic industries, and supported those industries that suffered the more. Of course, hospitality business, international trade, wholesale trade suffered the most. And again, those businesses are mostly run by individual entrepreneurs. We have also digitalized, we have increased the degree of digitalization of our government so that we could sustain certain governmental procedures. Let me highlight the most important social support measures. Of course, there are measures in healthcare system, we supported business, etc., etc. But those measures are pretty much standard compared to everybody else. I will speak in more detail, again, take into account the main themes of the seminars. So, we have supported the most vulnerable and low-income groups of populations. That includes the additional funds for families with low income, that those families that get benefits with children younger than 14 years old. We have also childcare benefits for families who have kids up to 2 years old. We have spent over $140 million. Uzbekistan is not such a big country. I believe you can find Uzbekistan on the map and you would be able to identify the GDP, the volume of GDP. We have increased by the factor of 2 the amount of people. We have doubled the number of people who get welfare, and we have automatically extended the welfare payments. The special benefit for families with kids younger than 14 years. We also have the special childcare benefit for families with a child of the up to 2 years old. We also were giving special food units for the most vulnerable group of population. We were also providing masks to the corresponding groups of population, specifically for the elderly. We have introduced the interdiction. We have prohibited it for the. We have pretty much we have disallowed for the employers to fire the employees. We are ensuring that all of the teachers are getting their money, their salaries on time. Of course, the educational system is in Uzbekistan is public owned. Of course, we have some private education, but still, mostly education is public, and of course, the government is paying salaries there on time. That also covers all of the cultural venues, all of the sports venues that are also supported by the federal budget. We have also halted income tax. From July 1st, we're going to introduce the special addition to the salary of those who's working in different kinds of administration bodies. Following the example of many countries, in Uzbekistan, we also introduced measures to support small businesses. We are also fighting the unemployment, and we're also going to minimize the economic shock. We have introduced tax preferences, etc., etc., that suffered the most. We have also introduced loan payment breaks no matter what's the rate. So, in 2 months of COVID prevention, we introduced this social protection measures. In order to finance these measures, we have introduced a special kind of anti-crisis foundation, which is $1 billion US. Dear colleagues, our effort are supported by our partners, international financial organizations such as World Bank, the Asian Bank of Development, etc. I'm sorry, we're really out of time, Jahangir. As far as I understand, you have told about the key measures. The colleagues have written them down, but we have to continue. I would really want to hand the floor to Robert Joyce. Robert Joyce, we're really out of time. Robert, we need to have some time for questions. Robert, are you there? Or who's going to take the floor?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Да. Yes. Да.
Yeah.
Слышим
Great.
тебя.
Thank you. So I think Olga is kindly controlling my slides. Thank you, Olga, and I'll tell you when to move on to the next one. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the crisis and the social protection measures that have been implemented in the UK. I wanted to begin with a little bit of background in terms of the policies we already had and how that compared to other countries, and that helps to think about how I think our response to this crisis was shaped. I mean, so first of all, really, this, as would have been true in some other countries too, to a different extent perhaps, this crisis came when we were really still in the hangover from the recession a decade earlier. In particular, we'd had, in the UK case, although we'd had actually really very robust employment numbers, they had recovered very quickly after the financial crisis and had carried on growing throughout the 2010s. We'd seen terrible productivity growth ever since the crisis had hit, and with that, terrible pay growth for those who were in work. So that was looks like one long legacy of what happened in the late 2000s. And there was a small pickup in the middle of the 2010s, briefly, and then that was itself rather cruelly then choked off quite quickly because after the vote for Brexit in the referendum of 2016, the sterling depreciated and therefore inflation rose, and that really killed off the real growth in earnings that we had just begun to get back. So overall, we had this long hangover from the last recession, a very, very slow recovery. When the recovery came, it was actually quickly killed off by another factor. And we'd also had pretty much a decade of austerity measures. So after the late 2000s recession, because of the fiscal deficit, we had many, many cuts to different activities that the state does, including social security. And so as part of that, a number of cuts in particular had weakened the link between the amount of support that you can get from the state if you fall on hard times and the actual costs that you face. So in particular, much weakened support for the cost of housing and also for the cost of children. So in a way, what you can see here is that we came into this crisis in a much more precarious position than we might have expected to. And that's partly a result of the long kind of macroeconomic hangover from the last recession and the lack of pay growth that went with that. And it's partly a result of the fact that we had been cutting back the amount of insurance that the state provides to people in the event of another shock, which is obviously what we've now experienced. And even in slightly longer term context, there are some other long-term shifts in policy, which in some ways are a little unfortunate when viewed through the lens of what's happening in the current crisis. So in particular, what we'd seen in the UK is that the welfare safety net had been increasingly focused on in-work support, on topping up the earnings of households who are in paid work but on low pay, and increasingly not focused on the out-of-work safety net. The out-of-work safety net had drifted further and further behind earnings levels for a long, long time. And up until recently, this was seen as, this didn't get a lot of attention, in part because so many people were in work and the problem was low pay and topping up low pay. It wasn't really about supporting those who don't have work. But we had made the observation 2 or 3 years ago that in this sense, although in some ways we got lucky with the Great Recession in that it didn't hit employment very hard, it hit the earnings of those in work hard. And our welfare system is actually relatively well set up to insure households against that because of all the in-work benefits we have. Were we to have another recession of a different kind, which hit employment very hard, which we hadn't actually had for about 30 years, well, then the safety net would be stretched more and would be less well set up to insure households against that. And obviously, that's what's now happened as large sectors of the economy have been basically closed down. Another feature just worth mentioning is we have virtually no explicit earnings replacement component in our social security system. So unlike many of our particularly many of our European neighbours who have schemes where if people fall out of work, they can get an state insurance payment or a payment from their employer, which is some fraction of their previous earnings when they were in work. We don't really have anything like that, or barely anything like that. So there was a group of people who were previously on reasonable earnings, but had, of course, spending commitments like housing and other things that were commensurate with that level of earnings. Were they to fall out of work, they wouldn't get much earnings replacement and would therefore be very vulnerable to the kind of situation that we're in now. So I think that's just all quite useful context for understanding where the UK was coming from. So the new income protection measures that the UK, so the next slide now, please, Olga, thank you. So the new income protection measures that the UK introduced then, the big one was that we basically invented an earnings replacement scheme pretty much from scratch. So for furloughed workers, so for workers for whom firms do not permanently lay them off, but they just temporarily don't have any work to do, the state set up a scheme where it will pay 80% of their previous wages. Any top up from the employers is optional. So essentially there's no cost for this period of an employer keeping, unless the firm goes bust completely, there's no cost to the employer from keeping workers on their books for the time being, even if they see virtually no viable long-term future, because the state will pay 80% of the wages and the employers don't have to top that up, although some do. So in terms of the short-term income protection that offers workers, it makes a massive difference, a really massive difference. So for example, so this is in comparison to just the standard out-of-work welfare safety net that we had before. So for example, if you take a worker and an average worker who loses their work, before this scheme, they would have lost just over half of their family income, their net family income, if that happened. Whereas this scheme reduces that to just 13%. The main point of this was seen as wanting to protect jobs that still have a viable longer-term future. It's repeating some of the ideas that have been mentioned by, I think, Roman and others. It was, to protect employer-employee relationships, which in the long term are still valuable. You don't want to destroy that kind of matching capital, the sort of firm-specific knowledge that workers might have, if there's still a long-term future for those jobs. And so the aim was to tide things over so that when the economy could bounce back, it could do so quickly and efficiently and wouldn't need a massive round of rehiring and a bunch of reallocation of workers to firms. That was the basic idea. We also increased the level of the pre-existing out-of-work social security safety net as well in a couple of important ways. So the standard out-of-work safety net was increased by about £1,000 per year for a family, and the amount of rental support was also increased as well for those who are renting their accommodation. Nevertheless, even despite that, first of all, on average, those temporary increases to the out-of-work safety net do not even offset the cuts to the safety net that had been made since 2011 as part of the austerity measures. So in longer term context, that's kind of important to see. And also the effect is still here very much a two-tier system, where if you are a worker who is laid off by your firm completely, for example, because your firm goes out of business, you get a lot less than if you're a worker who's also not doing anything productive right now, but is on furlough. So there's this sort of two-tier, there is this very much two-tier system at the moment. And I'll just say a little bit about the self-employed. These are a particularly difficult group for the government to target in various ways, partly because there's no existing kind of employer through which to make the furlough payment. So it's harder. The government doesn't have the administrative apparatus there as easily. It's also, of course, much harder to monitor whether a self-employed person has lost business or not. Here, the government tried to broadly replicate the furlough scheme for employees in that it will pay a grant that's, again, equal to 80%. This time, 80% of the average of the self-employed person's profits over the previous 3 years. To get this grant, you just have to say that your business has been affected. Even if it's only been affected by a tiny amount, you just have to it's been affected by the crisis. So you can see this is where there's just no good way of really monitoring who's getting this in the same way that you can do for employees. And so in many ways, this is very generous. It's very generous in some ways because, for example, even if your profits had only been affected by 1% by the crisis, you can claim 80% of those profits from the government. It's also the case that there will be firms, self-employed people whose profits were going to fall anyway this year, just for other reasons, because profits are volatile, but they get 80% of their previous 3 years' profits, and that's quite a good deal. And yet, despite that, there are many self-employed people who are falling between the cracks. For example, if you have a new business, the scheme does not support you. And if you get just less than half of your income from self-employment, for example, if you're combining self-employment with employment, well, then this scheme doesn't support you either. So it's much harder to target the self-employed, and you see that because many more fall through the cracks and many more get a very good deal at the same time. And this graph sort of illustrates some of that. So this shows you how much of your family income you would lose as a self-employed person, splitting that from low-income self-employed people to high-income, left to right. Without the temporary reforms, if you lose your job, you can see that self-employed people would tend to lose about 40% of their family income if all of their self-employment profits dry up. With these reforms, that's obviously changed a lot, but you've still got a number of people who lose quite a lot, particularly towards the top of the distribution. That's partly because there's a cap on the overall amount of grant that you can get, which affects those on higher incomes. It's partly because some of these people will have high self-employment profits now, but didn't over the past 3 years, and so they don't get much subsidy. But you've also got people, particularly at the bottom, who gain quite a lot as well. That's partly because the out-of-work safety net has been increased, as I described. It's partly because some of those people have very low self-employment income now, but had higher income in the past, and they get a grant on that basis. But you can also see that for those whose work is barely affected, but who can still claim the grant because of the reasons I described, they can actually gain. They can be a lot better off as a result of the crisis financially than they would have been. So again, just sort of highlighting the targeting problems with getting support to the self-employed and to the right groups of self-employed people. Just moving on to the next slide. Thank you. Just a couple of quick comments there on the policy measures. So first of all, I mean, there's a couple of positive things to say, I guess. First of all, this furlough scheme that was set up, given that we had nothing like this at all before, in some ways it's quite impressive that it was done so quickly, and it clearly has had a massive effect. About a third of the workforce have been on furlough. So the rise in unemployment would almost certainly have been far larger without it. And if a vaccine came along tomorrow and we could just get restarted, presumably that would be much easier to do quickly and efficiently, having preserved all of these employer-employee links, than if all of these people had been laid off and those links had not been preserved. But of course, there is a real issue about how we wind this down and how we get this third of the workforce off of furlough eventually, which I'll say a bit about in a moment. And the direct monthly cost of this is absolutely huge. It's about the same as our national health service. It's a bit like having 2 national health services for all of the time that this persists. Although, of course, the argument is that the cost of not having it would also be massive, which was the whole point of the scheme. Another positive is that the standard pre-existing means-tested safety net seems to have coped very well with the massive administrative burden that it's faced. There was a lot of concern about this. We had about 1.5 million more new claims to out-of-work benefits over a 4-week period from the start of lockdown than we would normally expect over that time of year. And it seems that most of those were processed very quickly, actually. There's a related issue here which might be important in the longer term, which is that, of course, we've seen many people claim these benefits for the first time. They had never claimed these benefits before. They're not normal welfare recipients. And so there's already a lot of discussion opening up about whether this will have important long-term effects on the take-up of support of these benefits, and perhaps on things like public attitudes as well towards the welfare system, which might have longer-term implications. And just my final slide, if I just have 1 or 2 minutes to finish, I just wanted to reflect on some of the immediate challenges. Obviously, there are so many challenges in the medium and longer term coming out of this, but a couple of the immediate challenges which relate to things I've already said. One of them, of course, is how we wind down this massive furlough scheme, where we've got all these workers sitting, doing nothing economically productive right now, getting most of their wages topped up by the government. There are clearly issues here about, as economic activity does start to come back, as consumer demand starts to come back and restrictions start to be eased, we don't want to discourage firms and workers finding innovative ways of getting back to work. And obviously it's a very costly scheme. So there's a lot of eagerness to wind it down as much as we can, consistent with not severing the valuable employer and employee links which was the whole point originally of the scheme. So the government's going to start asking for a firm contribution to workers' wages for furloughed workers from August. It will be gradually increased. It will start out at 10% and will be increased to 20%. And the government is now pre-committed as well to closing the scheme completely by November. Presumably because the value of certainty here is very high for firms and workers planning kind of what to do, and for a worker, whether it's worth holding on to waiting for their previous job to come back, or whether they should start retraining or looking for other work. But of course, this comes with risk, because we don't know in November what the situation will be. If we have to reimpose another lockdown, is the government really going to keep this scheme completely closed? It seems questionable. So that's a really difficult balancing act, of course. We've decided not to differentiate the scheme across sectors as we wind it down. There was clearly an argument for doing that, because sectors like restaurants, where the demand is not going to come back very quickly for some time, we might want to be thinking about those sectors differently from sectors where we think that productive and safe work is going to become possible again soon. The government decided not to do that, I think, for a few reasons, much of them to do with practicalities and trying to define what sector different people are in, for example. But there are clear risks there, I think, then of a lot more unemployment in particular sectors, and perhaps a lot more firm closure as well. I think one general point is it's increasingly clear that we do want some reallocation of workers from job to job. We don't just want labour hoarding, which is kind of what the furlough scheme originally was designed to achieve, to preserve existing links. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that just preserving the pre-crisis economy in aspic is going to be very costly in and of itself. There are people out there who would be much better seeking new jobs, maybe in new sectors, rather than waiting months and months for their old jobs to come back. So particularly you might think some of the young workers who don't have much firm-specific knowledge, they haven't spent that long with their existing employer, rather than sitting on furlough for months and months to come, it would be better for some of those people to start looking for new jobs in new sectors. And that's not even to mention the possibility that maybe the crisis will actually have a persistent and maybe permanent effect on the optimal size of different sectors if we get things like increases in IT and e-commerce. And that would clearly also suggest we want some reallocation. So it's kind of increasingly clear we actually do need some reallocation, as well as just labour hoarding. But of course, on an individual basis, it's very difficult to identify who should be holding on to their previous job and who shouldn't. And that's a real challenge. And just a final comment on the challenge, I think there's a real question about whether the state has the capacity to do all the things that it would ideally want to be doing to help the labour market adjust to the massive dislocation it's just seen. We've seen, even in particular examples like with fruit pickers, how long it can take in particular occupations for reallocation to happen. We've had examples where fruit pickers need workers. There are clearly lots of workers without anything to do, and yet there have been shortages in the fruit picking sector, which is related to the fact that it just takes the market a long time when there's a lot of dislocation for firms and workers to find each other. And this could happen on a massive scale, I think, without some perhaps government help in greasing the wheels of the labour market. So I think the potential role for active labour market policies here for many more people than we had in the system before is massive, whether it's things like online platforms for job posting and matching in certain sectors, perhaps in some cases direct public employment, for example, in areas where the skills of unemployed workers match up poorly with the skill requirements of the new private sector jobs that are arising, and retraining as well, given the need for some reallocation. So I think all of this, there's going to be a stronger than usual case for the government looking at, and there's a real question about whether it really has the capacity to do this adequately for the massive number of people that we will probably be talking about. So that's a quick wrap up from me.
Спасибо, Роберт. Очень интересное на самом деле выступление.
Robert, thank you. It was truly very knowledgeable. Very interesting. And we see certain crossroads that we have been discussing in Russia as well, such as whether we support those who suffered the most or we support everybody blanketly. So unlike Britain, we decided to select those who suffered the most. Now we see that there are certain drawbacks to that idea, but certain advantages as well. For example, defining the presence of an enterprise in this or that industry. So maybe there were disadvantages to the decisions that we made in Russia. I'm very happy to say that you have means testing tools of support and that you've been able to handle the 1.5 million of people who actually applied for the support, because we're going actually to broaden the system nationally in Russia so that more people would be able to apply for welfare. So your successful experience is a good sign for us. So the ability of a system to be resilient, to react quickly is important to us, so that the systems will not freeze digitally and in real life as well. People go to websites in Russia and they cannot get any service. They have to actually walk with their bare feet to those kind of the administration centers, etc., to get their welfare check. That should be digital, of course. I loved your idea about the platforms for searching for jobs. Whether the government should do that or the business can do that, this is a question, because the businesses are also interested in establishing this kind of platform naturally. Establishing this kind of connection can be a good business for business. That's what I'm talking about. But of course, the government can participate because Russian employment systems are powerless. This is a dead end for Russia. We need to totally shake up the system, and the creation of these kind of platforms are the way into the future. Therefore, I would like to hand the floor to Yerzy. Yerzy, the hosts are requesting me to tell everybody that everyone has 15 minutes. I didn't do that first. So Yerzy, you know that you have 15 minutes. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I hope you can see me and hear me. I hope that I will be able to do my presentation within 15 minutes. First of all, I would like to thank you for hosting the seminar and for inviting me. I'm very happy for not forgetting me, for you not forgetting me after me leaving Moscow. But today we're going to be talking about social policies during the coronavirus. My plan, what I want to today speak about, is the way of Germany, the measures of social support, financial support. I'll be talking also about the measures and how they influence the labor market. Motivation. Every day we have the new situation. Every day we have something new. We need to solve something very quickly and very flexibly every day in Germany. First of all, we took care about the health of the population. From March, we began closing schools, shops, offices. So what's next? The next idea was preserving labor and national economy. So what have we done? First, investment into the healthcare. Over 67 million euros for hospitals. Why? Because People needed to go to hospital, but hospitals need to be open. Nobody wanted to go to the hospital yet. So the hospitals, which are private, were not getting any money because people were afraid to go to the hospital. Also, we provided aid for those who work, families with children, students, workers of industries of art, those who support social services, private entrepreneurs, small and medium-sized businesses, and also large companies when necessary. So, financing. So we needed only to actually apply new credits, new loans, about 353 billion of euros. National budget spent 353 billion euros, and also provided contingency loans of 819 billion euros. So, we have this protection screen where many institutions work together and they provide help to everyone who's in need. The employers, those who are self-employed, medium, small-sized businesses and self-employed. Also, we're providing social aid, and we're also providing tax relief. So, welfare for those people who were furloughed. For those who were furloughed, and we have good experience here for those employees that lost part of their working hours. For example, if there is a contract for 40 labor hours a week, and for example, if there are less hours for worker within a week, then this employee can actually apply to the Ministry of Labor of Germany. This employee can ask for help because, for example, the employee doesn't want to leave the job, but he cannot earn enough because he doesn't have enough work hours. So the employee can apply for help, informing that he needs additional help, and that employee would get 60% of the net salary. For example, if my working contract is 40 hours of work a week, and I work only 20 hours, that means that I get payment from my employer for that 20 hours, and 60% of payment for the remaining 20 hours I get from the government. But this payment is transferred through the employer from the government. If, for example, I work less than 50% of the hours, in 4 and 7 months, this percentage of payment goes up to 70 or 80%, plus 7% if there's a kid in the family. We also introduce flexible schedules so that people do not work side by side and do not get sick, so that they could work according to their convenience. Also, we have helped people to switch from office to home office mode of work. That is also all a part of the employment security. There's a fee of 1.24% from employer into the Social Security Fund. If we speak about those who work for the government, those who, such as all of the state employees or the government employees, for them we provide additional payment of 1,500 euros. Private entrepreneurs and self-employed, they received social aid. Of course, we need to check their assets and incomes. Of course, we need to check whether they need help or not. The key thing for us here was to facilitate the access to social aid, to welfare. Up till the end of the year, they can apply for the 6 months of aid without any means testing of their assets. Now, 7.5 billion euros are invested into this kind of social aid to private entrepreneurs. We believe that there will be about 1 million people who would need this help, but only 70,000 people have actually applied. What can a family get? Of course, what I have said, social benefit, special relief, to compensate the rent for the adults. It's somewhere between 345 euros till 432 euros, and also 250 euros up till 325 euros per kid. There's also extra childcare payment of 155 euros. For those employees who need to take care of their kids at home, and they cannot go to work because, again, the schools are closed, the kindergartens are closed. In that situation, the government is paying them 67% of their lost income, but not more than 2,016 euros per month, up to 20 weeks. If the parent has to stay at home to take care of the young kid and cannot go to work. Also, we provide guarantee. We provide guarantee against eviction for households. Urgent benefit for those for self-employed and small businesses. So we have a subsidy of 9,000 euros. What else can the business get? They can get social benefit. They can postpone their tax payments and social payments. They can pay their tax installments. That they have actually protection against bankruptcy. Up till September, they can keep on working and get the welfare, and they will not be registered as bankrupt. Then, we also provide loans for partial employment and also support the rent for those people who lost their income. Also, every federal government also supports people locally. There are different categories of those who provide social services: therapists, nurses, those people who get money for social services. Of course, their aid is necessary, but different organizations that provide that kind of aid just don't work. They're closed. So we decided that this category of population needs to get 75% of their income based on their income from the latest 12 months. If this organization provide their buildings and territory and venues and rooms and halls for coronavirus aid. For example, if there's an organization that provided social services and it has some buildings, rooms, some kind of area that can be provided, can be used to treat the patients, coronavirus patients, then all of the employees of that organization get 75% of their previous salary. there are different kind of a capital support. Next measure, the fund to stabilize economy, over 100 billion euros for big companies allocated within that fund, and some tax measures. We have allowed our companies to pay their taxes later and less, and they can get their tax returns faster. But it's not only businesses that need help. Of course, municipalities need their help too. Municipalities have their public debt. We have written that debt off up to 45 billion euros, and we also compensated loss due to taxation up to 12 billion euros. There are pan-European crisis measures, over 2 billion euros there, but let's not go into detail there. The influence. What can we see here? We can see here that in March and in April, several thousand of organizations, 7,500 organizations actually applied for aid in terms of part-time employment, sub-employment.
Им через эту неделю 4 миллиона людей вернулись на работу. Но это не значит, что 7 миллионов людей...
It doesn't mean that we have 7 million people unemployed. In April, we had almost 400,000 people who lost their jobs. 113,000 of them, those are some self-employed who lost their jobs. 82,000 people are workers to hire and self-employed who did not return into the labor force. 140,000 are unemployed who are not included into any kind of retraining program, and 46,000 people are all others, people who are sick, for example. So turns out that unemployment grew by 13% in March and by 18% compared to the same period last year. Talking about different federal units. And there's lots of questions to you, by the way. So please be quick. The most problematic situation were people without any particular training, professional training, and for the immigrant workers. A few words about unemployment. We have actually two systems: social payments for unemployment and insurance for those people who are out of the workforce and they are getting the money that according to the salary that they were getting previously. Social benefits are for people who do not have enough money to live, but they can go in, they can work. So in March, they had over 77% who needed extra support.
Но в мае эта цифра поменялась, и потому мы сейчас решили делать дальше программы. Сегодня решили
So in May, this figure has changed, and we have increased this package up to 160 billion euros for targeted programs to sustain the economy. So our main mission was to preserve workforce, preserve jobs. We need to make this protective screen for the employed and for the economy. And the fact is that our short-term measures have worked, but we don't know anything about the long term. Thank you so much.
A lot of people are interested in art employees from the art sector. So many questions are about that. Why you singled them out? Why did you outline them in a separate group? That's the first question. Second question is, how did you actually come to realization that they are, workers in art industry and not just some sketchy people who want to earn money? It's easy because we have a social insurance system and everybody is registered. So we can just look at the database. So we check if they were paying all of the benefits for them. And actually, before the crisis, they were not covered by any welfare programs before. So they were just equal to small and medium enterprises. Okay, so the answer is that the social insurance system of Germany was formed under the aegis of corporate system, and everybody had their, independent systems, and you forgot about them at what point and then remembered. Correct. There is another question about the total volume. We were again trying to estimate that. So how much did you have to allocate additionally to your anti-crisis relief package for all of these new programs? Because many programs were existing before the crisis, but they were just scaled up. Now we have exceeded 156 billion euros. That's the first installment. And as of today, we decided to invest another 130 billion. And again, they include new guarantees, and we issued guarantees for 800 billion euros. What about GDP percentages? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that. I can't really say. Okay, that's just all right. I think everybody can just cross-reference it with further information. I think Natalia also had a question. Maybe she will ask you herself. Yes, I just wanted to clarify. So you have, a task on supporting measures that were undertaken on the preservation of social unity and solidarity. Why have you decided to put this mission? I agree with you 100%, but what was the German government rationale behind this program, and what sort of mechanisms work for that? It's the question about the competition and rivalry between people during these tough times. The main rationale was to keep people safe and not to infect each other. So that was the main reasoning in implementing this program, so that everybody would stand together. And this idea was to bring everybody all together, and that everybody would, contribute to this, so that there wouldn't be any sort of gap or disparity, so that some people receive more and some people receive less. For example, since late March, we implemented on a weekly basis new programs for different sectors of people and different occupations, so that again everybody would be included and nobody would be excluded, so that somebody could state that I didn't receive something. Thank you, Jerzy. Now I give the floor to our another speaker, is Mark Blitcher, Chief Director in Health and Social Development in South Africa. Please.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. So my name is Mark Blitcher. I work in the Ministry of Finance, the National Treasury in South Africa, where I look after the health sector and the social development sector. All right, we can move.
Yeah, you may.
I'm not sure whether I'm meant to have my setting on Russian or English, because I can hear background echo here. I'll switch to English setting and see if that is better. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, thank you. So in our country, an infectious diseases crisis has effectively, after 2 months, is heading to become a debt crisis, with our national debt potentially heading up from 50% of GDP to 90% of GDP. And shutting down the entire national economy for 2 months has severely prejudiced national revenue, national tax revenue, with our commissioner of our revenue authority saying that this could decline by as much as 25% for the year. So when one shuts down the entire economy, what we found is many firms, particularly small firms, cannot survive for more than 2 to 3 months because they have to continue to pay for their accommodation, their staff. And if the shutdown is to go on for more than 2 to 3 months, we will lose many jobs. The immediate casualty was the informal sector, and job losses have already exceeded 1 million, but in some scenarios could go up to 3 to 5 million job losses. What we saw emerging fairly rapidly was tremendous hunger, food queues for people queuing for handouts of food up to kilometers long, and even rioting for food in certain cases. We have put certain social protection measures in place, but we found it very difficult to sustain these for large numbers of people for long periods. Because of this, we've had to end the hard lockdown and find a more refined response, even though the epidemic is growing, to protect against economic crisis. The next slide, please. So the nationwide lockdown started on the 27th of March, which is just over 2 months ago. We were in lockdown for 2 months. There were huge outcries for food and other support as hunger set in, especially for these households in the informal sector, and government had to respond to cushion these poor households against the harsh impact of the lockdown. The next slide, please. South Africa has, next slide, please. So South Africa has a strong social assistance system, but a very limited contributory Pillar 2 social security system, but a strong Pillar 3 private system. We entered into the pandemic with a weak fiscal position, a deficit of around 6% of GDP, interest rates rising to interest expenditure up to about 13%, by the outer year of our 3-year expenditure framework, 15% of government expenditure. Although the government fiscal position was under severe pressure, this was seen as a once-in-a-lifetime black swan event, and we needed to protect the population through the lockdown. With the pandemic, not only has growth slowed down substantially, we'll have a recession with growth declining by more than 10%, but the tax stance also shifted to try to protect businesses from going under. So we've had these unprecedented revenue shortfalls, large fiscal deficits, which will probably exceed 10% and reach 15% of GDP. And as a Ministry of Finance, this could be sustained for a relatively short duration, but if it goes on for longer periods, there are major risks for employment, poverty, GDP, revenue. It becomes very difficult to sustain. And we've effectively had to more or less go into a much softer, more refined lockdown. You'll see there's an icon at the top right of each presentation, each slide. It says stay home. from this week onwards, we are no longer staying home. The new government icon is "Stay safe." So, in a sense, we've had to more or less end the hard lockdown, which in our terms we call going from stage 4 of the lockdown to stage 3 of the lockdown. The next slide, please, if you could change the slide, just shows the South African labor force. If you could show that table on the next slide, please. We have high unemployment in South Africa, 6.7 million people unemployed, which is 29% of the population. And that was before COVID, so very high unemployment. An informal sector of 3 to 5 million people, depending on who one counts in. Some of those numbers are shown in the table below. And a relatively small employed formal sector of 16.4 million people, which is 42% of the age cohort. For time considerations, I'm not going to go into the detail of the table. If you could shift to the next slide, please. So the first social assistance step that we did was to increase existing social grants. South Africa is a very unequal society, one of the largest Gini coefficients in the world. Around 30% of the population receive social assistance at baseline, which are unconditional cash transfers. And in the short term, we needed to try to reach these 3 to 5 million people in the informal sector. But of course, many of them were not recipients of social assistance, but 60% of them lived in households where poor people, particularly poor children, were recipients. So in the table in the slide, you can see that we increased the child support grant from 445 Rand per month. You can divide by about 10 to get into euros, roughly, by 67%. And we increased all the other social grants for the elderly, the disabled, by 250, which is about 25 euros per month, which is, you can see, about 13 to 24% increase. If you could go to the next slide, please. And then so these were, you could change to the next slide, please. These were temporary measures. We decided to extend beyond the more limited period of 3 months up to 6 months. I think you may have gone forward one slide. If you could just go back one slide. The total cost of them was 33 billion Rand, and they build on existing programs and existing social assistance infrastructure, because obviously the existing system is much easier to build on. Next slide, please. Then we introduced 2 new social assistance measures. The first was, if you can just go to the next slide, please. The first new measure was a caregiver grant for mothers of children. And we have 12 million children getting grants, but we also have 7.1 million mothers who are also, because they're the mothers of the children or the caregivers, they are on the Social Security information system. So it was relatively easy to pay them. And we introduced a new grant of 500 Rand, which is about 50 euros per month for them. And a new social relief of distress grant, which is a cash grant via banks or via what we call cash send, of about 35 euros per month, about 350 Rand. Now that's a new grant, and there was quite a lot of debate around who should qualify for this grant, which is why in this table you'll see a lot of uncertainty around the number of recipients who would receive this grant. It was uncertain whether we should focus on the informal sector, extend it to all the unemployed. What about everybody outside the labor force, wives, children, even of wealthy people, who should be covered? So it's a new grant, and there's a lot of uncertainty still on what the uptake will be. The next slide, if you can change slides, please, to the next one, just talks a bit about the new grants. Again, because we're running out of time, I'm not going to go into the details of some of the criteria for this new social relief of distress grant. I think I'm just going to proceed rapidly, Nazarov, because of time consideration. So next slide. Another slide, please. So this just looks at the budget for the different social grants that were increased. This slide was a total of about 33 billion increase. You can see it in the different grants, the biggest one being in the child grant. The one that is going to have to increase a lot more is the lowest one, which is the social relief of distress, which is 3 billion there. That's probably going to have to be increased further in the adjustment budget up to about 15 billion, bringing the total allocation to 50 billion rand, which is about 5 billion euro. Next slide, please. Next slide, if you could change slide. Okay, then on the Unemployment Insurance Fund, which is a Pillar 2 social insurance fund, a special temporary relief scheme was put in place called the TERS, the TERS scheme, which is administered by the Unemployment Fund, a sliding scale from 38% to 60%, with a minimum floor of the minimum wage, which is 350 euro, and a maximum of 670 euro. And so far about 15 billion has been paid through this fund. But again, this fund, like was said by a previous speaker, our tax authorities were stronger than the fund. The fund was quite bureaucratic and quite slow to pay out. So it was a bit weak administratively. Then if you can proceed to the next slide, please. Change slides, please. Okay, so then we put in place also a number of other interventions, and again, because of time, I'm not going to go through them all, but we put in place an employment tax incentive. We increased an existing incentive and broadened it. I'll just, for time reasons, continue to the next slide, please. Sorry, change slides again, please, to the next slide. So I'm just going rapidly now because I think we're over time. So overall, the response was quite large, about 10% of GDP. So it was quite an expensive country response for the country. And it was felt by our president and our Minister of Finance, we needed a strong response. But now, 2 to 3 months later, we're finding the risk of the country heading into a debt crisis effectively because revenue has dropped enormously, growth is dropping enormously, and so we're having to find a more refined response to the epidemic and start getting people in a risk-adjusted way back to work. Next slide, please. Change slides again, please. So this just shows how the 10% of GDP, this is some of the measures that were in the 10% of GDP response. The first one, a very big also loan guarantee arrangement, wage protection, 40 billion, that's about 4 billion euros, health sector, 20 million, that's 2 billion euros, municipalities, 2 billion euros, income support, you can see large amounts there. Okay, next slide, please. You can proceed to the next slide. This is just some of the ways of trying to finance the 50 billion euro package. It's about 500 billion rand. I'm not going to go through the details of this, but for the first time, South Africa has had to, as a country, start borrowing from international sources like the New Development Bank, the World Bank, the IMF. So this is almost the first time our country has been involved in this kind of large-scale borrowing, 95 billion rand here, that's 9.5 billion euros. Next slide, please. Change slide, please. Again, because of time, I won't go through the details of the tax responses, but it was a lot of measures by our tax authorities to try to make it easier for employers and companies not to survive this lockdown, and also to help individuals. So I won't go through the detail. Next slide, please. you can change slides. And this again is just some of the numbers for the different tax measures for COVID. Next slide, please. Change slides again to fiscal policy. Thank you. So on the fiscal position, I think I've already mentioned all of these things. Our president talked about that the president wanted the Minister of Finance to put a wartime budget in place. So this was seen almost as a war. And the problem is that such a strong response, it was good in many ways, but now it's coming through in terms of massive debt and difficulty in servicing that debt and the long-term implications of what it will do for long-term allocations to departments. Already we're having to reprioritize around 13 billion euro away from other spending areas to try and finance some of this response. Okay, next slide, please. Change slides, please. This just very rapidly talks through a whole lot of public PFM, public finance management measures that we've had to use to get funds rapidly to a whole lot of health and social security areas. We had to use a lot of tools and mechanisms to be able to move funds rapidly. The next slide, please. You can change slides, please. Okay, I'm not going to go through the details of this, but like your artist scheme that you asked about, Nazarov, there's like quite a lot of different types of schemes, private and public sector schemes to protect different groups of people. Each of them getting funding through different mechanisms. Again, because of time, I won't go through the detail. Next slide, please. And I'm coming to the end now. If you could change slides, please. So some of the lessons for us is, firstly, I think as a Ministry of Finance and as a country, we underestimated the rapidity and the scale of the income protection crisis that would emerge. Fairly soon after the lockdown, people who would be paid weekly stopped receiving income, and some of those people had no savings. So the level of hunger that emerged was much bigger than we anticipated. We identified resilience problems, weaknesses in our social security organizations, SASA, which pays our social grants, and our unemployment insurance fund. For the first time, we're paying grants to unemployed adults. We're having to deal with the informal sector also for the first time. We're having to strengthen electronic linkages between systems, different government systems, because we don't have a computer electronic system which links all our different funds. We're having to use new payment mechanisms for the unbanked, and one or two other lessons, which I won't go to now. And so if we could just change slides to the very last slide, and then I'll be finished. Last slide, please. I think, yes, thank you. So this is interesting conclusion. So in the 2 months of the lockdown in South Africa, income protection has emerged as a massive challenge. What we've already had to put into income protection is more than double what we've had to put into the health sector response. We've had to use multiple financial management instruments to get funds there rapidly. But closing an economy for 2 months has caused a serious challenge to growth in the fiscal position, which is going to take quite some time to try to recover from. And because of this, it's been very difficult to sustain the lockdown, even though cases of COVID-19 are still growing. So we've had to move to a more nuanced response to the epidemic to avoid further collapse in the economy. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry for the lengthy duration.
Спасибо, Марк. Ну вот мы решили, что на дискуссию у нас на дискуссию совсем мало времени.
We are having very little time for Q&A session. But I'm ready to give the floor for 5 minutes for just small answers for questions, and then Lilia will give our conclusion to our seminar. Are there any volunteers with questions? Right. We've had a very fruitful and interesting discussion, lots of new information. I think everything was relevant because, again, we were very interested to listen to the experience of Belarus, Germany, South Africa. You know, we're living in a global village after all. I do hope that our colleagues also drew some interesting lessons. Yes, maybe Sasha would like to say something. Sasha, are you with us? Because we haven't heard anything from her, from that person today. No, I don't want to say anything at all. Well, it was very interesting. Well, what was interesting? So I really enjoyed the South African presentation. So they had a very tough situation, but still they got everything going. So it was very interesting to listen to them. That's good. Tomorrow we'll have a regional session. So we will work on a regional level within Russia. So I thank everybody for their attention and their time. And now let's hear for the final results and the conclusions of today, because it was a quite fruitful discussion, lots of interesting and new things, and I still have to, you know, sleep on lots of information today because the situation is quite diverse for every country. Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. And indeed, I would like to say that we are starting to see the importance of these virtual reality and all of the virtual conference calls. I think this is a big change that we have to accept even after the pandemic. So I have lots of topics that I would like to touch upon because our today, you know, events, I think makes top 10 of my personal favorite conferences that I've been a part of this year, because, you know, certain numbers and conclusions are just staggering. You know, this is something that I would have never discovered on my own. So I thank everybody for their presentation. So on that note, we conclude today International Day of our workshop seminar. And I would like to also say that, you know, lots of different regions work with us. Despite a short amount of time, I will list. So with us, we have Republic of Tatarstan. I hope you're with us. I welcome you. At the very least, I've seen you a lot on the screen today. I hope you were listening quite closely, and we'll see you tomorrow. We have Republic of Dagestan. Yes, hello. Oh, there you are, Elvira. Hello. How are you? I hope you're well. Yes, I'm well, thank you. Right. This is very good that you're with us today. Republic of Dagestan, I hope you're handling COVID, you know, because I've heard news that your region takes the toll. We have a Pskov region, Yakut region, Baikal region, Orenburg region, Altai region, Stavropol region. So those are all of the regions that I've seen in the list of participants, colleagues. And if I did not name you, I apologize. I don't mean it, because we invited quite a huge list of participants. But these are the regions. They are one of the oldest friends and partners in crime in our collaboration within the framework of World Bank. I welcome you all and thank you for your attention. And I think now is the time to draw the line and make some conclusions out of today's sessions, because I was writing down a lot of information and I tried to systematize it. So first of all, let me start with the discoveries that I've made for today. Well, first of all, South African presentation was very interesting. So thank you, Mark. And thanks for Alexandra's efforts as well. Your presentation again was very informative. I will, you know, absolutely use the conclusions and lessons within the context of my international comparisons that I make in my scientific studies. I'm also deeply grateful to Ruslan, Vladimir, and Nitin for the generalizations and presentations that they made. because we will listen to your presentations many more times, and we will, of course, make references to them. But I outlined 3 questions, even four questions, sorry, 4 items that I wanted to emphasize. So first of all, is that many of our speakers today mentioned the nature of this crisis that we're seeing. It is, of course, unique. And here I would like, again, outline 3 scenarios. Vladimir and Nitin and Ruslan and Yerzy also spoke about these scenarios, because, of course, this crisis is a special case. And you cannot try to fight it, the one that we used in previous crises, because we have to take the different methods. You know, we don't need to, you know, use something that we are good at while fighting previous cases of financial and economic crisis. But this one is a whole different beast, because if we are just going to use our old tricks, we will be destroyed and left defenseless. Ruslan also emphasized, and I agree with him, that yes, of course, it's COVID-19. This is a sudden stop for global economy, but let's not forget that we entered COVID with already a very close state of, you know, can be described as crisis. You know, it's something that I think about all of the time. It wasn't the COVID that finished us off. I think it was a natural progression of things. It's actually, you know, something that I've been thinking a lot, time and time again, because this, again, the sudden stop for the entirety of global economy, it happened because, well, first of all, we were seeing efforts of, you know, breaking away from globalization trend, because a lot of countries were fighting against it. And I think COVID actually helped some of the countries to achieve their anti-globalist attitude. And again, we had a lot of debts when we entered the COVID. So, you know, for some, you know, states, COVID can actually be considered something beneficial, because as we can see, we see a lot of debt relief. So, of course, we started fighting COVID on a quite high, how should I put this, high risks of another systemic crisis. And another point that I outlined is that every country started fighting differently. So as we've seen in our presentations and in the cases, some countries focused on fighting poverty, some focused on fighting unemployment, or, for example, as the UK or Russia, they had a similar approach, and a lot of grants, one-off universal payments. Some countries favored some classes than the others. As we can see, there is a whole variety and a whole bunch of different cases that we try to use. Another conclusion that I drew for myself is the repercussions and, again, the results of crisis that we also talked about today. So yes, of course, I'm talking about poverty. And I think it was Roman who was talking about, not about just poverty, but also inequality. And in his presentation, he mentioned, and I quote, COVID broke our social contract. And I agree with that, because I think that many people perceive this current situation when all of the obligations and contracts were basically canceled. For example, here in Russia, we also had the social contract between these, you know, unregistered employed people who don't pay taxes. We allowed them to work, even though we knew that they didn't pay any taxes. But COVID proved us wrong, that this negligence to these shadow sectors of economy can be quite deadly for those that are subjects and part of this economy. So this social contract, I think, is now being reformed and restructured by all countries, because we did not know at the start what sort of mistakes we were making. And I also emphasize, I actually got, very happy that when Jerzy said that Germany constantly was discussing the COVID issue on the basis of national solidarity and not within the context of, trying to save the economy, or, for example, helping other classes and the different classes don't get help. So there were problems, there were resources, and now they had to work only in solidarity. So what else was quite interesting for me to hear? Well, of course, repercussions, the restructuring of the employment system, and yes, remote work is becoming the main launch pad for many economies around the world. Another thing that I'd like to mention is, of course, the demand for new skills. Because as we can see, as a result of COVID and isolation and lockdown, it also created a lot of opportunities. Another thing I should mention is that in many countries, COVID basically pushed them to undertake some measures that I think were a high time for them to take, especially digitalization. For example, sure, some countries are more tech savvy than the others, but now coronavirus forced everybody to become digital. And I see, a lot of people who are now becoming subjects and interested in remote education. We have our partners with us from St. Petersburg that were talking about this many times, that they should of course restructure on a legislative level the format of education, because the current education system, it is quite outdated, and a portion of it should of course go digital and go remote. Of course, many people were against that, because not many people actually understood how they can effectively manage their labor remotely. But now we are coming to realization and understanding that people who had at least a smidgen of working digitally and working remotely, they are, the ones that basically saved their skin. And it is a very, happy occasion for all of our employees of our university who are working remotely right from the start. I also would like to say, speaking about the processes, is that, of course, crisis helps us to solve, as I call them, outdated and obsolete problems. For example, in Moldova case, we've heard that it allowed them to motivate people to become subjects of a system of medical insurance. When you not force them, but you implore them to become a part of that system. And for Russia, I think it can also be used for legalization of this shady sector of economy, the unregistered employed people. And I think in some way we can actually make those people become a part of our, insurance system. In UK scenario, I think it was mentioned that, the agents were changing. Several people said that, for example, tax service is becoming a very active participant in combating coronavirus. In Russia, it's actually the same. Tax service is one of the, main actors. But we see new actors also come out to the field. And of course, these agents, they have to be assigned a certain function, because sometimes we don't have people who are actually experienced in working with these unregistered employees. So right now we are starting to launch this new technology in social assistance program in Russia. And now I'm hearing some feedback from the governors who were actually fighting against this program. Now they're saying the opposite, that yes, using the social contract scheme, we can create, certain workplaces and create new jobs. and make people become legal and come clean with their unregistered employment. And that's, of course, always good. The income support of the UK was very interesting case to listen for us, especially in Russia, because I believe, well, other participants also enjoyed listening to that, because it is quite relevant to the Russian case. We have a similar situation because, you know, the unemployment was very low when we, you know, encountered coronavirus, but now we have about 19 to 20 million people who are in a shaky position, who are on the verge of getting laid off, or they're not getting paid. So this was very interesting for us. And of course, I understand this is not our topic, but I cannot help but mention it because, again, coming back to COVID, you know, the scenario and this taking care of elderly people and creating additional accommodations and care houses, it showed that we are actually having a lot of weaknesses in this department, because in Russia we don't actually have those care institutions. For example, when I look at Italy, Spain, Russia, I don't know about Germany. I don't have much knowledge about that, but we realized that, you know, we were not ready. Within our reality, we were not ready to take care of all of the elderly, and they were also unprepared for that. And I think one of the main conclusions for Russia is again creating the new sectors for social care. This is something that we have to grow about. Also, to conclude, as third case I want to mention is social assistance. So I believe that, you know, a basic set of measures, you know, was similar in almost every country, which included increase the numbers of payments, subsidizing of your income. So all of the countries tried to use this trick and this mechanism. I would like to thank Jerzy that he drew the attention that they also focused on children. And actually, I believe that Russia could also use the experience and this technology to our advantage, because we also have to think about how can we, you know, retain the employments and their occupations, because we don't have lots of social programs here in Russia, because we don't have a lot of institutions that could actually, you know, follow the same policy just as they used in the UK, because, you know, people said that also there was a lack of institutions that could work with families. And I believe that this experience is also very useful and interesting for us to consider. And when Ruslan was telling us about what sort of a crisis we're experiencing right now, he also said that this crisis with pandemic also opens the door to new opportunities, and all countries, I think, started implementing new measures, you know, new forms of support and all that. So how do you, for example, restore your economy, and how do you start surviving and living in this new normality? This is the task that is for all of us to overcome. We also mentioned about new agents, about new payments and new reliefs. Well, several speakers also emphasized the fact, and I would like to mention that in Russia we also noticed this, when we actually render this matrix approach assistance, we need to rethink about how do we implement this means test. Is it about companies that are on standby, or is it about calculating how much income we have before the crisis? So there are different approaches, and I understand that certain changes are again necessary for us to implement, because again, if we take a look at the disparity of income, whether it's high or low, or people have lost their jobs and there is some confirmation, what sort of income do we have to reimburse them with, and how do we estimate as and classify them as those that are living beyond the poverty line or not beyond the poverty line? So I think it's very interesting for us to consider. Also, support groups was also quite the topic of discussions, and they look quite similar. So children, elderly, healthcare, self-employed, small enterprises, medium enterprises, also informal employment. I think Russia also suffers greatly from informal unemployment. Just as Mark said, in South Africa, there are a lot of people working in the sector of economy, and in Russia, for example, they can only receive some benefits and reliefs only through their families or children. And there are certain forks in the road, as I would like to call them. We mentioned several times about what sort of paths and ways we should undertake on helping people. And this indeed is a problem for many countries. And who would become the driver on the job market? Is it a certain agency or a new platform? Because I believe it should be a new platform, because again, employment agencies were either, inefficient, or maybe we should make them, restructured, or maybe we should think of a new systems or formats or tasks to, make them busy. And if our colleagues have any ideas, we would be very grateful if you are going to, discuss this with us sometime in the future, because really, job market is again one of our weakest points in Russia. And I cannot help but also mention two numbers that drew my attention. One of them I already mentioned is that in Germany, if you have children, you have additional 7% in subsidies to your income salary. And I think Martin Revalion and Ruslan, the number of 2.5% of GDP as a baseline for supporting people who are in need right now in the wake of coronavirus. Ruslan, if you can, send me a link. Where'd you get this number? Because I cannot, confirm it anywhere, but I need to make sure that it's the right one, because I need to use it in the further studies. So this was quite a discovery and revelation for me during this seminar, and I will sure to use it in my arguments in the creating new programs of supporting poor people. So colleagues, thank you very much. Again, to reiterate, I will listen to this workshop many times. I hope you will agree that we are going to post this webinars to make it available to all of the participants. Right now in Higher School of Economy, we are making sort of a weekly digest of what is happening in the world because of coronavirus. I will be happy to get into partnership with all of the speakers that we saw today to provide and share their materials for this digest. I'll be really like that. I think now it's a high time to go and drink some coffee, and you will, I hope, drink it with somebody who is close to you, because in lockdown it is very important to be with somebody. And I'll see you tomorrow. Yeah, thank you for your hard work. So Olga will tell us about when do we start our day, and tomorrow will be just as interesting as today. Yes, colleagues, I would like to add something. We have one question about the registry, social system registry. Let's just write it down and put a pin on it and discuss it tomorrow. Yes, let's discuss it tomorrow, because then we've gone beyond the time frame. So let's just return to it tomorrow. And on my behalf, of course, I would like to wish everybody good health, so that nor you nor your dearest and nearest would get sick, and always be happy. So I wish you well. Olga? Yes, thank you. So tomorrow, the second part will start 12 p.m. Moscow time. Just as today, we'll send you the link about 30 minutes prior to the start of the workshop, so that you would make a sound check and the presentation checks, especially those that are going to speak tomorrow. So we'll see you very soon. The email that we sent with the confirmation, we sent you links for both today and tomorrow, so you know where to look. So I'll see you tomorrow. Yes, so see you very soon. Thank you, colleagues. Yeah, thank you for the conclusions, for presentations, and for speeches. Yes, thank you, Elena. Thank you. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Александр, завершаем.